My name's John Lawrence. I started working on Capitol Hill with the class of 1974, which is one of the reasons I'm writing a book on the class. What lessons have we learned? We have three truly outstanding scholars on this last panel. So our first is Norm Ornstein.
The Democratic Study Group, under its longtime staff director, Dick Conlon, became a major force, crafting measures, incremental steps starting in 1970, pushing through with the initial caucus after the 70 elections in 1971, taking another set of steps in 1973 to loosen up the strictures of the seniority system, to open up a process moving away from secrecy, joined by an organized Republican effort under what most people are shocked to hear, Donald Rumsfeld, with Rumsfeld's Raiders. The Common Cause, a pretty new organization at that time, and you had a press corps that was an ally in the reform effort. We went through 40 years of Democratic hegemony in the House, 26 in the Senate, and now it's a much different reality and much closer. Now partisan tribalism dominates much more. And if there are threats perceived to the institution from a president aggressively using executive authority to challenge congressional authority, you don't have the same kind of institutional cross-party patriotism. You don't have the same kinds of organized reform forces with the clout that they had before. But I don't hold out a lot of hope that the kinds of things that were done that did open up the process and made Congress a better place, not a perfect place, but a better place, are anywhere near coalescing at the current and very difficult moment.
Our next speaker is Professor Frances Lee.
I'd like to begin by focusing attention on the dramatic intensification of two-party competition for control of national institutions. Since 1980, Democrats and Republicans have each held majority status for 9 Congresses. The evenness of this partisan balance is not typical for U.S. history. The more typical pattern over this long period is for one party to enjoy a significant advantage over the other. Shortly after 1980, the Conservative Opportunity Society formed in the House of Representatives, trying to convince other Republicans that a Republican House majority was within reach. The most obvious consequence is that with 2 such evenly matched political parties at the national level, all reform proposals will be scrutinized intensely for any whiff of partisan advantage. One of the likely reasons why the congressional reforms of the 1970s ever happened is that Democrats weren't afraid of losing their majorities and did not see Republicans as a threat. So Republicans gave the 1970s congressional reformers bipartisan support. By the late 1970s, a cadre of activist members led by Newt Gingrich sought to use C-SPAN and every one of those other new opportunities to highlight the Republican message. To the extent that there's any reform energy in Congress at all right now, it seems to me primarily centered among the right wing of the Republican Party. There's no sign that Republicans will follow the lead of the 70s liberal Democrats in opening the legislative process up in ways that might endanger Republican majorities, however. When majority control of Congress hangs in the balance, members tend to prioritize partisan identity over institutional identity.
Lastly, I'm pleased to introduce Julian Zelizer.
The gridlock on huge challenges that the nation faces, such as immigration, and the polarization over almost every issue imaginable, has left many Americans throwing up their hands and saying that Capitol Hill is in the worst shape ever. I've often looked for those moments when Congress has had a huge impact and Congress has changed. So there's no better place than the Watergate babies, the class of 74 and 75 to explain kind of what are the conditions necessary to get Congress to reform itself. How do we create an environment where reform, institutional reform, is something that is central? So 3 things that I think were going on that were very important in the 60s and 70s, and also in the progressive era, frankly. One were social movements and the pressure social movements were placing on Congress for institutional reforms. The second was the emergence of something Norm was talking about, really a reform network, I think of it as, of organizations and groups in Congress who were consistently and continually pushing for these kinds of changes. And third is both the pressure from the media to deal with these issues, the space the media gave to dealing with reform, but also the nature of journalism itself, which has changed quite dramatically. So can we fix it? What has to take place? The 1970s suggests that we can. We didn't get everything we wanted. The reforms, some of them intended, turned out in ways that were unintentional. In many ways, ethics reform, sunshine reform, party reforms made Congress better. It certainly didn't make it perfect, and it certainly didn't mean that the reforms would have an indefinite shelf life, but they did change the way Congress worked, and I think often for the better. The final factor I'll talk about is the media. We need social movements, whether on the right or left. The second is I do think we need a reinvigorated and a strengthened network of reform organizations. And finally, we need a media that's both willing to give serious coverage to how Congress works and what Congress does and how it can be better.
So what I'd like to do is summarize very briefly the list of institutional reforms and also electoral reforms that have been suggested by our presenters, and in the context of where do we go from here. Where do we go from here? Well, one popular reform is that we need to stop the Tuesday-Thursday Club and require people to work here 5 days or more a week so they get to know each other better, to try to get them to live here and their families get to know each other so they can work better together. A second one, and it's been mentioned many times, is return to the regular order. To have conference committees, we passed the Affordable Care Act without a conference committee, which is phenomenal. And to limit restrictive rules, we may have some disagreement there, but I think that's a reform that a couple people mentioned that's important. Budget process reform. I think Dave Obey would get rid of the budget process except for CBO, and many people are that way. I would suggest that we should just force an enforcement of the calendar, try to stop the growth of these CRs, and abolish or significantly reform the debt limit requirements. We're one of the only nations in the world that has a requirement to vote on a debt limit, which creates unnecessary conflict, in my opinion. Stop all new backdoor spending by the authorization committees. It's against the rules, and we should try to stop that. Also streamline the committee system. I worked with several of you in the room on committee reform, especially in the Senate, in reducing the number of committees and committee assignments and realigning jurisdictions. It's almost impossible to do that, but I think it's important when you have 214 committees and subcommittees, with 109 of them with jurisdiction over Homeland Security and 58 over energy and environment. We need to look at that yet again. And then a key part of representation in Congress and in America is pluralism. And this pluralism is expressed through interest groups and lobbying, and we need a more transparent set of rules. On election reform, several were mentioned. Many of them are almost impossible to get, but we need, at the state level, we need an increase in the use of open, nonpartisan, and blanket primaries at the expense of closed or semi-closed primaries. I don't think there's complete consensus here about that, but that was a recommendation. The redistricting process, I would argue, needs to be out of politicians' hands, and here we'll get a lot of disagreement, and into citizen commissions as we have in California and 10 other states. I think it brings about a modest amount of competition in the general election, which brings about more moderation when you have competition in the general, more moderation of individuals coming into the body. I think everyone agrees we need campaign finance reform, and we need to curb this influence of, quote, dark money, and increase the abilities of individuals to influence elections. Citizens United totally changed the entire world of campaign finance by allowing the creation of these super PACs. Leadership PACs are part of that, and the quota system for people in the leadership committees and subcommittees and other positions undermines trust in government. Also, it makes it very difficult to govern. We need to break the deadlock at the Federal Election Commission, not mentioned here, but certainly that's important. Maybe change the structure of it, but certainly start enforcing campaign finance regulations. So are all of these possible under the conditions that we have right now? I think Julian gave an excellent summary of the fact that you need social movements, you need well-organized groups pushing for reform, and you need a media that helps you. Well, what do we have? We've got lots of groups in Washington, D.C. pushing for reform. I'm involved with a bunch of them. They're great. They've got great data. But we've got a media that's becoming more and more interested in scandal, but also it's becoming more polarized. I have a book called American Gridlock with colleagues that's coming out that documents empirically the polarization of the media, the polarization of state legislatures, the polarization of the electorate. It's beginning to occur on basic social issues, and certainly the polarization of Congress is documented in this.